Is that cool? It's an MP3 voice recorder. It's like the raddest ever. It's recording right now, so say something funny.
Yeah, haha. Wow, you are a very beautiful device. That's very attractive.
He's on his way. They just
The door's open, so he can just come in whenever.
This goes right into MP3. That's like the only format.
Totally.
Can we have a few seconds?
I'm already 15 minutes late, so I can't, but sorry. But he can just come in and like get set up. That's okay.
So just go and take one.
Yeah, totally. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm the Snow Queen. It's nice to see everybody. I'm always glad that people come by. Thank you. Today, going to be continuing the magic series. And today we're talking about another great word. I love using nice words. Panpsychism. Anything that has the word psych in it is usually fun because you know it's going to be kind of crazy, a little bit brainy, but also a little bit psychic. You don't know, which is exactly what today will be about. I also included in the title Dr. Christian De Quincey, and his book Radical Nature, which I recommend. It's pretty good. He gets into really excruciating detail about the philosophies involved, which sometimes can be a little bit of a drag, but I really like how he compares all the different ones. And even though I don't necessarily agree with all the stuff he says, it's a really good book to kind of delineate all the different versions of how we look at the world. And today's lecture is pretty important, I think, because I titled this whole series The Nature of Magic. And I titled it The Nature of Magic very purposefully because nature is magic and magic is in nature. So today we're going to be kind of looking at how nature infiltrates magic and how that influence extends into nature. And we've talked about some of the major concepts like how we influence each other, how we can influence the weather, you know, things like that. And today's lecture will really kind of look at that underlying mechanism for how it is that we find influence in nature. And the main way that happens is because, I think, and this is my opinion, and we're going to talk about some of the myriad views surrounding this, but it's because there is consciousness extended into the world of nature. And there's many, many philosophies. I mean, most philosophers and idealists have tackled this question in some way or another, right? And they kind of mostly disagree with each other, and then they all come up with the same theory and name it different names. So when we're talking about panpsychism, one of the things you're going to find out is that there's also all these other names that it's called too. So you'll be like, oh, I totally heard about that, but it was animism. So the reason that it gets so spread out and crazy is just simply because there's all these philosophers that want to try and make you think that they thought of it first, so they call it their own word or like name it after themselves or something like that, which is really irritating when you're trying to get down to the bottom of these ideas and philosophies, right? Because you're like going on this trek like Dr. De Quincey does in Radical Nature, where he's looking at all these different philosophies, right, for how consciousness is in nature. And he literally is going through like all these different people, and you're reading it and you're like, well, they're all saying the exact same thing, but they just all have to call it their own thing and make their own manifesto, and then they steal it from the Greeks or from the Egyptians, and then they say, oh, this is occasionalism, or it's animism, and I totally figured this out because I know what it is. So that's something that's really frustrating, and the only reason I'm going to talk about these philosophies as such under their titles and names, and even the word panpsychism, which was thought up also by a philosopher who gave it his own little name, is to try and get that into your heads that this is a recurrent idea that keeps coming up through different philosophers, but in fact goes all the way back into the shamans. Again, we find it with shamanic origins, and into the fairy people and the fairy faiths and all that kind of fun stuff, which is the fun part of what we'll be talking about today, instead of all these really important-sounding philosophers from Europe that like to try and steal things from primitive cultures and make it sound like they're very scholarly. So the reason why it's important, I think, to talk about how consciousness operates in terms of matter and how it relates. First of all, we've had all these problems because of these philosophers like Descartes, who split mind and matter. They say that these two things have nothing to do with each other and they're very separate. So we have to kind of like rework them together in our brains and say like, no, that's not cool, and just kind of like fix it in our heads so we can like reestablish it, you know. And in terms of magic, like all these things I've been talking about in terms of magic, how we hold influence, how our conscious minds can hold influence, whether it's hypnotism or changing the weather or anything, we have to think about, would that even be something that would be possible if there were no consciousness in the material we were trying to influence? For example, if you're a shaman and you are going to invoke a fire elemental and make fire or lightning or rain, if there was no consciousness in that fire or lightning or rain to receive your signal to try and attract it, would it even happen? Like, how would that happen if there was no dialogue, right? It would be impossible. So if there were no consciousness in matter, magic would be impossible. And that's just kind of my take. Because even from a logical standpoint, if you could not have that kind of conscious dialogue with the material to influence and to attract, to use like sympathetic magic or magnetic attraction or any of that stuff, it only happens because there is that relationship. That's the only reason that it works. If all matter were dead and soulless and lifeless, then there would be no magic possible in the universe. Which, I mean, if you think that magic is not true, and like you're like a physicist somewhere, and that's just kind of like your deal, you'd be like, well, yes, then matter is dead. That makes sense to me because there's no magic. So I'm sure lots of people would disagree with me, but that's just, that's my own kind of take on it. So the point that magic exists, if you've ever seen anything magical, that's proof enough that there is consciousness all the way down to the material level. If you've ever seen anything magical, that means that there's some kind of conscious exchange happening in the material with your own little brain, which is made of material. It's also in the material that you're influencing. Remember, like all the material in your brain is the same. Like we're going to be talking about the elements. And we have all those elements in our brains and our bodies and everything. So it's just the inside and the outside being the same and having a dialogue. As above, so below. I always like to think of it like how we hypnotize each other. Like if you're going to get hypnotized by somebody and have like an influence on your consciousness, you can hypnotize the elements. Okay? Like you could hypnotize fire. And the reason that works is, again, through that conscious relationship. Because you have fire in you also. So it's like a sympathetic hypnotism. And like when the shaman makes rain or something, it's almost like he's hypnotizing the clouds to bring the rain, to bring them into influence, to cause the rain to come. And that probably sounds a little crazy, because I know when we think of hypnotizing, it's again that mesmer thing where you're like Svengali and looking all creepy. But hypnotism actually encompasses a much wider range, as we talked about. So I like to really just kind of think about that you can hypnotize elements and atoms and things like that, and that's how you can hold influence over them. It's kind of a strange thing to think about, I know, but just let it sit in there and swim around a little bit. The first kind of word I wanted to deal with is that philosophical genre, Panpsychism, and I got a really great definition of it from the Catholic Encyclopedia, which I always kind of look up and see what they have to say in the Catholic Encyclopedia, especially about things like occult. Like it's really fun to look up witchcraft in the Catholic Encyclopedia and like magic, and it's really very interesting to see what they have to say. And Panpsychism too is very interesting because they, of course, do not like Panpsychism at all. So reading their definition in there is always pretty entertaining, so that's why I chose that to use. And they define Panpsychism as a philosophical theory which holds that everything in the universe, the inorganic world as well as the organic, has some degree of consciousness. And we all know that the Catholic Church does not like that because dogs don't go to heaven. and they don't like you kind of purporting those ideas that, dogs and rocks and things like that can be in heaven with all the good white people of Europe. Anytime you try and say that, like, snakes or cats or stuff will be up there, they just get really upset. So they go into actually a pretty good little dialogue about what it is. They mention that it's related to hylozoism, another word for the same thing. So far we have panpsychism, hylozoism, animism. These are all the same theory. And panbiotism, which is another word, talks about the same thing. That was Paul Carus came up with panbiotism, which was pretty much the same. And then there was also Ernest Haeckel. I've mentioned Ernest Haeckel before. I love Ernest Haeckel. If you guys haven't seen his artwork, he would draw these insanely detailed paintings of, like, protist organisms and jellyfish and all kinds of stuff like that. And he came up with that idea that phylogeny recapitulates ontogeny. That's that one that we like to say 5 times fast, which is where he looked at all the embryos from everything and saw that at one stage everything looks the same, like whether it's a fish or a pig or a person, and they all like look the same, and then they split and start turning into something else. So he figured out that, like, every embryonic stage is just a recapitulation of the universe, like how the universe was made. And then it splits into different things. It's a great theory. He also was a panpsychist and came up with his own theory of panpsychism, which he, of course, named something else. And he also married his 13-year-old cousin. That's just a little fun fact that I always like to throw in there. So he had his own little theory. Leibniz, I don't know if you guys know who Leibniz is. He possibly could have made calculus before Newton. There's all kinds of debate on what happened exactly there. He also could have possibly based the binary number system on the I Ching. There was some debate because there was this Jesuit that brought it back and showed it to Leibniz, and some people think that's where he got it. Binary numbers is where we get, like, programming for computers, like all those zeros and ones, and that came to the West through Leibniz. He was a panpsychist. He had his own very in-depth theory of panpsychism, which he called monadism. And it's very interesting. If you guys ever come across a book on the monads by Leibniz, it's pretty amazing, all his stuff that he gets into there. And it's all, again, essentially panpsychism. It's the same thing. And so because there was all these separate philosophers that would kind of start their own little panpsychist infiltrations, you can see it in all these different ways. And what's great is that some of these names I just named, like Haeckel, he was a scientist, right, involved in, like, evolutionary theory. There's Leibniz, who, of course, was very involved in mathematics, and even though he was a metaphysician, he was very, well looked at the time. So you have all these different infiltrations of the shamanistic, animistic kind of worldview that's getting little by little into, like, science and math and stuff like that. So it's that's what I kind of like about some of these philosophers calling it different things, is because if they said this is shamanism and they're, like, scientists, everyone would be like, oh, God, like, they would just have a freak out. So they wouldn't listen to them. But because they call it these fancy names, then the concept is able to infiltrate all the minds of the squares. So I kind of like that it can get in there some way, even if it has to be kind of butchered and, egotistical and stuff like that. And then one of my favorite panpsychists was Paracelsus, also known as Paracelsus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, who was an early alchemist around the 1500s, who I've mentioned him many times before. He was very well known for curing an entire village of the bubonic plague once. He went in and cured everyone of the plague without managing to contract it himself. So that's a pretty, pretty cool thing to be able to do. And he studied, gemology and minerals and metals. When he was little, he would go into the mines and literally, like, dig the metals out. And he actually did that when he was a teenager, and it was at this place that overlooked the monastery for St. Hildegard of, you guys know St. Hildegard? And he was, like, totally in love with her, and he would, like, kind of stare out and be like, oh, St. Hildegard, as a teenager, which I think is really cool. But Paracelsus was a total panpsychist, even though he was Christian. He was not shy at all about mentioning his Christian theories and identifying with Jesus, even though he was an alchemist. And some people think it's contradictory that he could be a Christian and a panpsychist, because, as I stated, the Catholic Church says, no way, Jose, as far as consciousness being in matter. But he was actually responsible for infiltrating panpsychism in many parts of the world through his alchemical works. So he was really responsible for kind of keeping panpsychism alive in many of these places. And it was because he got so well known as a doctor, and he was such a successful doctor, that people paid attention, to what he was saying, because clearly he knew what he was doing, because he could go in and heal everyone of the plague and cruise out and have no problem. So people were like, oh, let's see what else he's talking about. So people paid attention to some of these panpsychist ideas, even though he didn't call them panpsychism proper. He would kind of bring them up in these alchemical ways, like as above, so below, and then extrapolate it and stuff like that. But the coolest thing that Paracelsus did in terms of that was all his work on the elementals and invoking the elementals, which is something I'm going to get into more detail shortly. So when we say that panpsychism holds the belief that God is permeating the universe and matter and stuff like that, what that means is it gives a differentiation of matter being alive and aware or being dead. And this is something that, science looks at this a lot too, even outside of panpsychism. And there's all these debates of where life ends. How do you tell if something is alive or it's dead, right? And one of the biggest ways they get into this is viruses, okay? Those are the big stinkers that make all the scientists go, oh my God, is it alive? Is it dead? What is going on? Because it's just this little thing with DNA that goes and spreads its DNA in there. And there's all this debate as to, well, does that mean it's alive? Because it replicates, right? There's all these different ways that scientists define life. It has to be able to reproduce is one of those key factors for being alive. And since viruses do that, then they are. But then these totally gnarly things like mad cow disease happen, which is literally a strain of protein. It's not DNA, it's not RNA, it's not even it's no NA, it's just a little string of a few amino acids that replicates. So, just thinking about how that could be in your brain. And what's so weird is that little string of protein attacks the brain, which is our central nervous system, right? That's crazy. Why wouldn't it go to anywhere else? If it's just a string of protein, why? How could it know to go right into the brain? How does it know anything? It's just this thing that's not alive, right? Well, that's where it starts to get a little spooky, when you can see just a little piece of a couple proteins with this totally aggressive, gnarly thing that is mad cow disease that goes so specifically into a brain. And scientists say, DNA can contain a lot of information. It could have that, go into the brain of the organism. There's all kinds of parasites that are very specific like that. Some of them will leave, toxoplasmosis, right, that gets into cat brains and makes them do all those crazy things so it can spread. There's all kinds of stuff like that. So, but with mad cow disease, it's not even in a string of DNA, so there's no room for that information. Where is the information being stored? In some kind of consciousness is really the only explanation I could say, right? How else would it be? Magic, really. There's no logical scientific explanation. So if you guys want to really make scientists mad talking about this, bring up mad cow disease, and they'll be like, oh yeah, I forgot about that. They get really upset. And this whole thing kind of starts with Aristotle, who goes off on his theory that matter is this dead, lifeless, inert thing that then gets animated by spirit, by consciousness. But in and of itself, it is this totally, inert thing that's just kind of lying around waiting for something conscious to come and take it over. And Aristotle, of course, was pretty influential, right? A lot of people listened to what Aristotle had to say. So the level of infiltration and the damage that was caused by Aristotle's worldview was pretty gnarly. A guy that kind of countered Aristotle to every degree was Giordano Bruno, who's one of my favorite Hermeticists. He also did a lot of sex magic stuff, which I always like to bring up. It's in Iano Quiano's book, Eros and Magic in the Renaissance. He was tortured by the church, by the Catholic Church, for his panpsychist ideas by telling people that matter was alive and animated. The Catholic Church didn't like people saying that there was consciousness extending throughout the world, so they killed him like so many other folks at that time. But one of the things that Giordano Bruno said about matter was, he said, the intrinsic power to generate all possible forms and the immanent intelligence to direct and govern all organized complex forms that issue from it. And he called matter, he mentioned that it comes from matter, like M-A-T-E-R, which means mother. And he said that all matter is from Mother Earth, and it's part of that mother living organism. And when he says that it has the intrinsic power to generate all forms, what he's talking about there is like the prima materia of the alchemists, that it has that potentiality, right? You can think about it like DNA, okay? You have DNA in your fingernail cell that has the forms of every other cell in your whole body, right? You take out your fingernail cell, take a stem cell, you can make a liver cell, you can make a brain cell, you can make an eye cell, just from that one cell's DNA. And all the alchemists felt that all matter had this in it too. It contained all the possible forms of everything. Goethe, the guy that wrote Faust, had a rad explanation of this through plants, and he believed that there was this archetypal plant that contained all other plant forms in this plant, and that all plants were just an expression of that mother plant. Okay? And that would be like a microcosm example of what Bruno's talking about. But the earth is the plant, right? That it contains every possible combination for everything that exists. That is also, coincidentally enough, the God particle that they're looking for at CERN would be exactly what Giordano Bruno is talking about. If you read about the God particle or the Higgs boson particle, as the scientist who put his name on it, they love to do that. The Higgs boson particle, they believe, is what assigns purpose to particles. It says you're going to be an electron, you're going to be a proton, you're going to be a quark spinning this way, you're going to be a quark spinning that way. And that's what they're trying to find out if it's there with the CERN particle accelerator, which keeps going back in time and destroying itself. I don't know if you guys have read that article. There's this physicist who thinks that the particle accelerator is traveling back in time to make sure that it doesn't work by sabotaging itself all the time. It's pretty great. If you just like Google it on the BBC, it'll come up. I know, it's totally crazy. But that's what they're looking for, and the reason why they want to find this thing so bad is because then there would be some kind of scientific explanation for consciousness exhibited in particles, okay? Because if there was, although they don't say, well, okay, how does the God particle do that exactly? Like, that's the question then you have to ask, like the chicken and the egg. Like, okay, if there is this particle that does this for all the other particles, like, where does it get its thing from? Like, there's got to be some other thing. And then you go back to God again, and then you're like, you know, all the scientists get headaches again. But that's that concept that it was a split, right? There was all these Greeks and then like Descartes and everybody that said that the material world, that's like materialism is what they call that philosophy, all the philosophers, you know, that it's just matter and there's nothing, it doesn't know what it's doing, it has no idea, like it has no consciousness. And then there's like all these other peeps like Bruno, you know, Paracelsus, all the panpsychists I mentioned, they're like, wait, there's some kind of consciousness in the table, like in the chair, like in the electrons, and the stuff that's like zooming around in the air, like you can just see that something knows what's going on. And then this was kind of stimulated and reinvigorated when they started seeing electrons exhibiting conscious behavior and being affected by consciousness. Remember, we talked about how influence happens on the shamanic level. We talked about the observer effect. And that's all the Heisenberg stuff, right? That when we shine light onto an electron, the wave function collapses and it solidifies into a particle. And that is a conscious reaction to an observance, or specifically to light, to photons. So electrons exhibit behavior that would mean that they know what's going on. Like they're like, oh my god, light, quick, freeze. You know, so because they do stuff like that, people are like, well, that's really weird. That shouldn't happen. Like, maybe they know something we don't know. And then they'll do stuff like be in, you know, different places at the same time that they can't really figure out. Like, they're real dodgy. Like, they kind of skip around. Like, you don't know where they're going. And we should be able to tell where they're going, like, because they should follow some kind of logical system. And sometimes you can tell, like, if they're going to be, like, at an energy level. But then we try and look at them, and they do weird stuff, so we can't tell. So, because there are some of these things that happen in quantum physics, scientists are also like, well, okay, that's weird. They are exhibiting some kind of behavior. We don't know if it's conscious, like maybe it's just a reaction to the photon or something like that. But that is a very common explanation that panpsychists will give for consciousness being shown on the material level. And then there's all the guys that say, well, consciousness is light. And we've talked about this too, that light is consciousness. That was Arthur Young's whole thing, right? With the reflexive universe. And I brought this was his little chart. Up here, he believed that all matter was just like this condensation of light. That everything starts as light, and then it kind of slows down. And as it slows down, it gets kind of sluggish, and then it turns into stuff. Right? Like light just goes like super duper fast like up here, and then as it kind of slows down and condenses, then it's like an atom and an electron, and then it's like you know? And then for him it was like reflexive. So for him it would come back up in this kind of enlightened consciousness way when it forms organisms. So he kind of said that light would condense into matter and then kind of lighten up as it came into conscious entities or sentient beings, so to speak. And that was like his whole deal, was trying to kind of prove that. And I brought these other little things which I think are good at describing that. With sound and electromagnetism, oops, I think that's backwards. When the frequency is like super fast, then it's like gamma rays. And when it slows down, then it becomes like, you know, all these things that we can see and hear and like interact with in the physical world and stuff like that. And I like to think of that when I think about Arthur Young's description of how light is. So like light is just like super duper fast, and then when it slows down, it aggregates into different forms, right? It's just the frequency of the wave that is different, and that's all. Just the frequency of the wave that is different, and that's the only thing. And like I said, there was also Walter Russell who held that same idea and did that great book, The Secret of Light, about it, and talks about that in there. So this is an important concept for what we're talking about, because if Giordano Bruno was right, if there was just one prima materia that makes everything else, well, I mean, that's exactly what these guys are saying. Like, it's just one thing with different frequencies. And that's why it manifests in all these different ways. There's just one thing vibrating at different frequencies, then you see all these differences. And that's what makes the different forms. That's kind of how I like to think about it when I'm trying to put it into those parameters. And we can see physically examples of these manifestations of frequencies in the elementals. And all those different frequencies you guys just saw is in the elements in chemistry too. You guys know, like, if you look at the periodic table of the elements, everything has a different number. It also has a different frequency. You know how you tell what something's made of? You put it in a spectrophotometer, which measures the light in it. It literally gives a readout of the light refraction off of it and like the color it exhibits. Like if you put in like some gold in a vial, run it through the spectrophotometer, it gives you the frequency reading. If you put in copper, you get a different frequency reading. That's how you know that it's copper, because it always has the same frequency. So it's literally like each of those are on these different like little wavelengths, and that's how they become separated into the different elements. And so occultists really were hip to that way before they had broken it down into chemical elements, but they broke it down into fairy-like type of elements, earth, water, fire, air. And then they had these spirits that were associated with these, that were like the rulers of those types of elements. It's almost like if you looked at the chemical table of the elements and realized that there was a little fairy that went along with each element that was like in charge of it. And that's what the occultists were like hip to, that they would describe. And when we think about Panpsychism, that there is consciousness in the world of matter, we have to look at the Celtic fairy faith to get a good description of how this works on a magic level. And the fairy stories are really, I think, some of the best ever in the world. And I wish that more people would keep reading fairy tales to their children. Like now we're getting all these stories that are taken from fairy tales, but then put into like these Disney stories, and then they kind of like lose all the horror and terror and that imbuement of the fear of God in the world. Like they kind of remove that whole thing, and like just like how the Little Mermaid gets to live. But so when they talk about the elements in occultism, they're very specific. And in Paracelsus' work, he breaks them down into who has rulership over what and what's in control. In the Celtic fairy faith, it's the same thing. I know I told you guys in the lecture series before on relationships, we got into the Evans Wentz book, Celtic Fairy Faith, which is a great book. He gets into like the best detail ever in that book and tells like real stories about how people's kids got kidnapped by fairies and stuff like that. But in there, he goes into the breakdown of what happened, and it actually correlates with the fallen angels story. Because what they say is like the fallen angels were falling from heaven, and then they all got frozen. Like where they were all like kind of falling in all these different places, and then like God said, Simon says, or whatever, and they all like froze like right where they were. And some of them were in the clouds, some of them were in the dirt, some of them were in the fire, and they all got like enmeshed with the material that was there, like inextricably bound up with the matter. So, like, according to them, like, there is literally, like, a spirit enmeshed, like, inside of the dirt. There's literally, like, an angel interspersed, like, within it. Like, it has this consciousness. And in the occult world, all of these different elements have a different kind of personality. They all have a different frequency. Kind of like the difference between us is like some fire fairy might be different than a water fairy. So they all have these different kind of things that go along with their personalities, things they like, things they don't like. They're all very specific consciousnesses. Okay? They all have like not only consciousness, but personalities and names. They have names as well, which I find very fascinating, that not only will like some big rock in Ireland be looked at as a fairy rock, but like the rock itself will have its own conscious entity, and it'll be called like, Sam or whatever. Like they'll have some name for the rock itself, like because it's this thing in the world that is like a sentient being. The rock itself has sentience, and like trees are like that too. Like there's a lot of these gnarly trees. Like there's that bristlecone pine up north a little bit, which is called Methuselah, which is the oldest living organism on the planet, with the exception of those like clone organisms that have like the root systems that go everywhere. The oldest one is actually technically in Norway, but the trees that grow from it are only a couple hundred years, but the root system is like almost 10,000 years old or something. But anyway, the oldest living tree is this Methuselah tree, which is like 4,000 and some years old. Okay? And it has a name. It is like a sentient being. It's this thing that's alive, that's been on the earth for 4,000 years. Can you guys believe that? mean, it's just amazing. I mean, what if you just stand next to it, like, this thing has been here for 4,000 years. And it's a little different than a rock, you know, like, okay, like rocks are conscious, but for something like a tree, like, it's like alive, like, you know, it's just crazy to think about. And that's how I like to think about, like, those kind of fairy consciousness entities. Like, a good way to kind of fix it in your brain is to think about, like, a tree or a plant. Because that is a little easier to deal with, maybe, than, like, a rock, or those are a little harder to relate to. Like, you know, I don't know, they're not as friendly or something. They're like a rock. But rocks are good, too. I mean, like, crystals and stuff, you can definitely tell there's conscious entities in a lot of crystals. And that sounds so New Agey, I know. But as I've mentioned before, crystals are where we get computers. The first radios were made out of crystals. I mean, come on, there's a lot of great stuff about crystals. They don't have to be super woo-woo. But so the fact that these, like, kind of elemental consciousnesses have been recognized by occult magicians for thousands of years is so great. But the other thing that I really like about them is that if you'll look at descriptions, some of the first descriptions of the elementals we have come from the Vedas, which of course are the ancient Indian books from India, not Indian like, you know, the wrong word for Native Americans. And they call them the Devas. And in LA, of course, Deva means something totally different. But in the Vedas, the Devas were essentially fairy folk, and they're described very specifically. And the way they get described in different cultures is what's so fascinating to me, because they're almost all the same. Like in the Celtic fairy faith, the Evans Wentz book, the first chapter he goes through and does a comparison between, like, Aboriginals in Australia, in India, in Thailand, although he calls it Siam. He goes through Native Americans. He says, look, these guys are all calling these things different names, like for their language, but they all have the same attributes, the same characteristics, the same personalities. Like the rock fairy in Ireland has the same personality as it does in India, as it does in Australia, as it does in, you know, Timbuktu. That's pretty weird, right? Unless these conscious entities in the things are having a communication dialogue with you. Then it makes sense, right? If I talk to you, Eric, and someone else talks to you, Eric, from India, you're going to be the same Eric, right? So, I mean, you know, with you might not tell them everything you tell me. But, so, like, if some Indian dude is talking to a rock that has the same thing, like, he's going to be saying the same thing as some Irish guy is talking to a rock. It's going to be the same kind of thing. And we've talked about how plants do this to shamans, right? There was that amazing book by Jeremy Narby, The Cosmic Serpent, where he talks about how the plants communicate to the shamans. Because that's another, like, big brain twister, right, was how do the shamans know what plant to take to get high? And with the ones in Peru, Jeremy Narby was like, well, ayahuasca, but they have to do this weird combo with this other plant because ayahuasca gets broken down in your stomach acid, so if you took it, like, nothing would happen. But then you combine it with this other plant, and then suddenly you're like, go time. And he asked the shamans, he's like, how did you know? Because there's like thousands, millions, billions of plants in the Amazon jungle. How do you know which one to take? And the shaman said, the plants told us which one to take. That's how we know. The plant said so. And maybe you've heard about people who talk to plants. Like, there is that great book, of course, by Peter Tompkins, Secret Life of Plants. And he did another book, which had like almost no press about it, called The Secret Life of Nature. I don't know if you guys have seen that, but it's about fairies and quarks and all the stuff I'm talking about, like consciousness and nature, where he gets way into depth about how people have communications with these spirits, how you can do it too. Like, that's a pretty good little, I know I always like to include little experiments we can do, because like you can see this stuff happen. It's not like a big mystery. You can just go do it. So you guys can try, like, open a dialogue with like your favorite rock or tree or plant or whatever, you know, just try and contact the fairies that are in there. And of course, one of the big things that I always like to point out with like coming into contact with fairies, it's interesting because a lot of psychologists explain animism, and a lot of anthropologists, they'll say, oh, these primitive cultures that, like animism, it's just childish because this is what children think. Children think that trees are alive and rocks are alive and that you can talk to rocks. And in a lot of the folklore, it's only the children that can see fairies. Like if you read a lot of the fairy tales, there's this whole thing about who can see fairies and who can't. Because there's only certain people who can see the fairies because they only show themselves to certain people. And it's usually, traditionally, children. And which is why in a lot of fairy tales, like it's the children that are kidnapped by the fairies or whatever. And there's all these great stories about like who can see the fairies. And even at the very beginning of this lecture series, I mentioned how magic has a lot to do with perception. And it's right, it was the whole rainbow thing, right? Like something comes into view that's always there, but then in a moment, some kind of perception shifts, the water hits the light, and you can like see it. It's kind of the same with fairies, I think. It's like that there's some little tweak in your perception, and then suddenly you can see the fairies that are always there, but like the rainbow, it takes some very specific, combination of elements to bring them out. Part of that is like, who you are, whether you're conscious and like trying to talk to them and invoke them, like all these different techniques that you can do. Like the shamans have all these techniques to open, dialogue with them. And in magic, especially occultism, one of the biggest things is this thing called invocation. And you guys have probably all heard about invocation. Anyone that's read an Aleister Crowley book, you see the word invocation, and it always means like some kind of spooky magic thing, right? When you hear the word invocation, like I invoke thee. But really it permeates all religions. Literally all religions use invocation, which means literally to call upon. And I had mentioned that there is this weird thing that happens with magic where you have to invoke things to bring the magic, right? You have to call on some other to get the sacred moment happening, right? And through most witchcraft or kind of paganism or Egypt, even you go all the way back into shamans, they call upon something and bring their conscious attention to it. Like they say, I call on thee, salamander, ruler of fire. I invoke thee, your energies for this specific purpose. And then they go and say what they want the thing to do, right? And then you get into like black magic and demons and stuff like that. That's what they're doing. Like when anyone calls on Satan, that's an invocation. When people invoke God all the time, like, or Jesus, like every time you say, oh, Jesus Christ, you just totally invoked him. It's true. Or when you say, oh my God, just invoked God right there. So we invoke things all the time, but we don't really pay attention to what we're invoking. So that's something else to think about, like just try and pay attention to things that you invoke. So it's kind of fun. But so this idea of invocation of elements was something that was very commonplace. Like any kind of shaman, before you even get started, you call upon the four winds, you call upon the four directions, you call upon the spirits of your ancestors, and then most often you'll call upon some kind of elemental or thing that's specific to whatever disease they're trying to cure. They'll call upon very specific entities and deities. And in Christianity, they'll invoke angels, they invoke Jesus, they invoke all kinds of things. Invocation of angels and angelic magic is, of course, a huge part of, Aleister Crowley's work, Golden Dawn, all the Egypt stuff gets into all the invocations of angels and stuff like that, too. And what I really want to bring home is that when people think of invocation, it's like you're doing it to call on some outside thing to lend you power, right? That's what you're saying, like, oh, Jesus Christ, help me, I can't do this by myself. It's a perfect example. Or prayer. It's also like an invocation. Please, God, help me pay my rent because I can't make it this month. Okay? So that you're like calling on some outside source of power to, empower you to be able to do something. That's what the shamans and stuff do. In my brain, the way I think, anything that's outside is also inside. Like when shamans invoke elements, We're a microcosm, hologram. So all those elements and entities and angels and everything is also on the inside of you. So, like, I always like to think, well, like, why is everybody always, like, putting it outside themselves? And you can really kind of invoke it from inside you, because even if you just want to, like, call on the wind or whatever, like, you got mass wind in you, you're taking in, like, oxygen and carbon and nitrogen, and all that stuff is in your body that's in the wind and the air, too. So when I think of, like, invoking all these elementals, like, in a magical sense, we can then make it alchemical if you can realize that all of those things are invoked not as an outside source, but as an inside source. And that goes back to this point that I've been saying in almost every lecture of how consciousness and that word came from consensus, right? That it's this mass amalgamation, not a singular entity. That it's because we are connected in the panpsychist way. If there is a consciousness underlying all this material in this chair and table and everything and in us, then it goes back to that consensus thing that we are connected to it also. And that conscious matter is also what our meat suits are made out of, right? That same kind of magical consciousness that we can perceive at the rainbow is also in here. You know, and that magic is not just like some far away, like, fairy thing, but to remember and pay attention to the fairies that are inside of you, too. Like, what if you have a liver fairy, right? What if you have a bad liver and you can just say, oh, liver fairy, come on, man, help me out. Like, invoke those fairies inside yourself, too, you know? Like, that's what I think is an important part of magic that I hardly ever read about in a lot of these magicians' dialogues. They always put it outside. And it's so ironic because panpsychism and animism, the point is to put man and nature as enmeshed, whereas other systems separate it, right? That we are we're nature's keeper, and God, too, gets separated from nature, put on some throne in heaven where he's, like, overseeing everything. But if you are truly a panpsychist, you understand that you're so enmeshed with that nature that it's literally all up in you, too. And until you can kind of realize that, like, that's what I think is the deepest, most profound realization of panpsychism, is not just that this consciousness is permeating the world, but that you're part of that as well. And then you get into the, like, severe mystical realization, you know, where you do have that conscious link to the consciousness in the material, because it's in your material too. You know, I always like to talk about the van der Waals forces where we exchange electrons and stuff like that. Well, if the electrons in this table are conscious and have that conscious memory, just like my electrons have that consciousness inside of them, then we're interchanging it with things all the time. So that are like, it starts to make the lines a little bit fuzzy, you know, when you start thinking about that. Like the lines that separate your meat suit from the chair that you're sitting in and everything like that, it starts to get a little bit kooky, but it's really true. And to me, that realization, that very alchemical realization of what it truly means when you say, as above, so below, that is the constituting mechanism of how magic works, because there is consciousness permeating nature, which also permeates yourself. And that's how influence is exchanged, is because there is that connection, that panpsychist connection, connecting all the minds. Because that's what pan means all, psyche is like soul or mind. It's literally one mind. And when you can kind of like start to like break apart the philosophy and really feel what that word means, it's a pretty powerful word, right? That you can even be a part of that. So to me, that is the underlying factor without exception for how magic works in the world and through influence. So that's all I have for today. Thanks you guys for coming. We're always open for questions, of course.
Yeah, where does the tradition come from that says you're supposed to warn against summoning dark spirits and stuff like that.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a thing, like, because elements have consciousness, there's this whole thing that, like, they can influence you. Like, you know, I said you can hypnotize the fire. Well, guess what? The fire can hypnotize you, too. Because it's a two-way street, right? If they have consciousness, too. And then you get into, like, all the gnarly possession stuff, where they can take possession of you, literally. So that's where the warnings come in. There is absolutely a risk, yeah. Because not everything has a nice personality, right? Like I said, they're all like talking to people, like talking to Eric. Like I might like talking to him, but then there's some jerk. Like, do I really want to? And elements are the same way, so that's a very valid point.
Well, sometimes, I think we as human beings are on a certain level, and there are spirits out there that are sort of more powerful. And more
Oh yeah.
So in dealing with something like that, if you have something inside you that's sort of conflicting, that can be sort of used in a way that you might not want.
Absolutely, but you got to remember, okay, things can only take you over. Like the Chinese medicine thing, right? They say disease takes you over when you have like a notch that's out of balance. Then the disease comes in. You keep everything like strong and your will strong, they can't get in. They can't take you over. If you are conscious that they're trying to do that, it's difficult because this happens. Like every psychological disease, right? And shamanism could be boiled down to something taking possession of somebody, But like Paracelsus going into the town where the bubonic plague was, he didn't get it because he was totally contained and consciously, willfully preventing it from entering him. Which sounds gnarly, and I'm certainly not advocating somebody like go into Ebola just to like test it out, but that's literally like how his mentality was, that he was consciously, and that's how the shaman is. Shamans, a lot of people don't know this, but shamans, straight up shamans, don't allow things to take possession of them. They remain conscious in their ecstasy. They don't give over their consciousness to some other entity, like some channelers
so they
do.
Can communicate
Exactly.
with the relative position state.
But they keep themselves, not privy to possession by that.
Okay.
But that's a very complicated question with a lot. Like when you start getting into possession, like there's this whole like world of stuff about it.
I wanted to ask about the other side of it, namely people who are probably lacking in certain elements of self-control, such as addiction, perhaps the homeless,
right.
So obviously there are things that all of us have within us that can affect extraordinary change, but some people lack them. So how do you explain
Well, what's funny? One of the biggest ways that you treat schizophrenia and stuff like that, heavy metals. Metallic elements are the #1 prescription for people with mental problems. You're giving them gnomes because their gnomes are out of whack. Interesting, right? It's almost always heavy metals. Like even going into Indian medicine, Chinese medicine, lithium, thorazine, all those are metals. They're all metals. Gnomes. It's totally, I know, it's rad, right? If only the psychiatrists knew they were giving everybody gnomes. Maybe, if they would just say, take your gnomes. Yeah. But yeah, when you get element imbalances in your body, it shows up as diseases. Like when there's, and literally like physical elements, right? Like dietary or whatever, they're treated with adding elements. Chemicals. Chemicals are elements, right? The periodic table of the elements. It's all elemental balances, right? With diseases and health. It's totally, and that's how the shamans would look at it. And now we just call it chemicals instead of gnomes and fairies. But it's the same thing. I know that sounds so crazy. Like if someone just came in, they'd be like, "What are you talking about?" But it's true. Anybody else?
So there's been a question that I've been kind of confused about for a long time, and to me it seems like it relates to what you've been talking about today, so I thought I would throw it out.
Sure.
So a while ago I read this guy, Ken Wilber.
Sure.
Not a lot of people have read it. And he has this whole theory about the developmental process of consciousness. And one of the major points he kind of strikes home at is that human beings are really special because we're matter evolved to a point where consciousness evolved to the point through matter where we have the potential to realize that we are consciousness, which kind of gives us this like inherent specialness, which is kind of cool, and I jive with it somewhat, but there's also a part of it that just kind of irks me and makes me uncomfortable and almost feels like egotistical and almost rude.
I really don't like Ken Wilber myself, and I hate his idea of that, and I get kind of upset because everybody like discludes animals from consciousness, and like even Terence McKenna did a stinker thing like that, where he said that he thought people evolved because they consumed psychedelic drugs, but in fact, lots of animals eat psychedelics purposefully. Chimpanzees, reindeers, like all kinds of animals do it. So I get frankly upset when I hear things like that, and I disagree because there are like birds, okay, songbirds. Take a robin redbreast, for example. They have a tagline song that is species wide, and then each individual robin redbreast will add their own riff onto the song, which means that they have a consciousness that they are their own entity, that they're different from that robin redbreast over there, and they can jam on their own little ditty because that's what makes them special. And it's different for every individual male robin redbreast. So that to me is like just one of the many indicators. Look at like, all the John Lilly stuff he did with the dolphins, how they told him like all this stuff about the universe and consciousness. I mean, just if you're looking at dolphins alone, you can go off forever on that. Like, I want Ken Wilber to go into an isolation tank and talk to the dolphins, so you can just erase that whole statement. But I know, a lot of people want to think they're special. And I think it's just this thing that people want to think they're special and more special than other people and everything else. And I think that is kind of a big thing that contributes to a lot of these hierarchical philosophies, is because we want to be special or more special than everything else. But yeah, I personally don't agree with that. I know that he thought about it a lot, he's definitely written lots of books about it. So, yeah, I agree with you. It irks me too. Yeah.
Well, from what I heard about that was self-consciousness.
Sure.
So, what do you think about self-consciousness, or what are some of your thoughts?
Sure. Well, Christian de Quincey separates like consciousness in his book and gives definitions. Like there's consciousness, and then there's like being self-aware, right? And he kind of breaks it down where you can be conscious and not be self-aware. Like they've kind of proven that can happen, and that's kind of where they get into like all the virus stuff, right? Like they think, okay, well maybe a virus is conscious, but it's not necessarily self-aware. Like it doesn't know it's Bob the virus, But like I said, lots of animals know that like they're Bob the cat, and that's, that's Bill the cat, and Bob and Bill are different cats, and they know that. So
What do you think the significance of that is, of knowing or not knowing?
well, I mean, that's like then you get into the Descartes thing, right? Like, I think, therefore I am, right? And then if you identify with your self-consciousness, then that is a separating thing that then separates the I and thou, but then, like, you have to be separated at first so you can see, oh, I'm me, but then I'm also part of all this. So it kind of goes in a big circle a little bit, I think, but that self-awareness and the universe's self-awareness of itself is something that's also been talked about in all these philosophies, like the Vedas, right? They always have, like, the universe has its own name, right, and is aware of itself. So that self-consciousness is intertwined in all these philosophies as well. And that, there's that Amit Goswami book that he did about it, The Self-Aware Universe. He's got a lot of good stuff that he talks about it in there too, in his cute little way that he does. Uh-huh.
So where does that place, like, we're just watching how they're growing hearts now.
Oh, they're growing organs, yeah.
They're growing organs now. So where does that place, like, man-made genetics and the cloning of DNA, like the DNA perfume that they're making? And
I know, from dead people.
Yeah.
They're making Einstein perfume from his DNA. Did you guys know that? That's totally true.
Are we going to start having to copyright our DNA?
Well, yeah, they're already making, like, if you have a baby, just FYI, they give you this thing that asks if you want your cord blood banked. And even if you say no, they take it anyway, and then they sell it for lots of money to a cord blood bank. Yeah, you have to actually put on there that you don't want it taken. Same with your placenta. They actually steal your placenta and then sell it for tons of money so they can take all the stem cells from it. So gnarly. But yeah, I think that, like, all of that stuff falls under consciousness too. Like, even, I mean, then you can get into the whole, like, technology place too, right? Like, where things we make have consciousness, right? Like robots, and then you're into, like, the Terminator world. And
well, like, I was thinking, like, information and electromagnetic fields, right?
Of course,
like,
sure.
Is that an entity?
Of course.
Are we going to start having, like, instead of devices that carry patterns of information, are we just going to have, like, an electromagnetic field that's stuck to us that has, like, the information of Joe Bob, who I want to call, you know? Like, is it
Probably already there. You know, it's just about amplifying it and tuning into it, right, is what technology does. Technology are just things that make it more, that, like, can make it from subtle to manifested. That's, like, to me, the whole purpose of technology is taking all this psychic crazy ether stuff, and then they, like, are able to, like, pinpoint it. I mean, that's kind of what all technology does, right? Sort of. There are all these psychical ideas that then take on physical manifestations, but it's all just energy forms, you know. A good book on that is that Secret Life of Puppets by Victoria Nelson. She's got good stuff on consciousness of, you know.
How its forms have been changing.
Yeah, I know. Uh-huh.
Yeah, are you optimistic that we'll make spiritual progress as we make technological progress?
I know, it's hard to say. Like, is that going to lead us to, like, a revelation? Will it be through crisis, or will it be a better way? I think I'm always optimistic about everything, which is really annoying to a lot of people, but I think so. I think that through the technologies we'll come maybe to a realization that they are just manifestations of our consciousness. A lot of people say, okay, well then, like, manifest a computer that you can use right now, and but in nanotech they use DNA for computers. Like, it's all inside your body too. So I think, like, the technology is just a projection. It's like alchemists that use a lab instead of Indian alchemists that do yoga. It's going to get to the same place. The Indian alchemist that's doing yoga in his belly is going to come to the same realization as the European alchemist who's futzing with the chemicals and the gold. So I think that, like, technology is only going to be a projection of that which is already inside of us. So I think it invariably will have to lead to that place. So yes, I'm very optimistic about it. Uh-huh.
It seems like with our ability to communicate more with plants, using psychedelics and all, that would open up the pathway to be able to psychically connect with each other, so language becomes superfluous. So why do you think that there's just an innate fear with being able to connect with plants and inanimate objects, because it is actually forcing all of us to communicate with each other in different mediums?
Well, I mean, a lot of that I think has been caused by these philosophers like Descartes and, like, these jerks that create these systems that then we use, you know, and that, I think, a lot of it's based on fear. I think you're right, you know, I think, but it's scary, like, try just sitting down and seriously, like, taking drugs with someone and having, like, this gnarly experience with them. Like, you're either going to never talk to them again in your whole life, or you guys will be, like, super tight bros, but it's a really horrifying experience. I mean, because we're just not prepared in our cult. Like, we have personal space, right? And, like, you don't penetrate the bubble, and we want to keep ourselves separated as this. We don't want to, like, get down with the fairies, because we want it, like, I'm Maja, and I know that I'm me, and I'm not part of this chair, and I'm not part of this table, and I'm not part of you, because I'm me. So until we can kind of, like, start to get over that, like, I think then you can talk to plants better, like, once you're over it, you know. But when you still are clinging to that meat suit, like, it's really hard to get past it, because it just makes this big gnarly wall that you can't, like, peek through, you know. It's difficult. Uh-huh.
So to share on the technology piece, I've been listening to Ram Dass. He talks about not getting identified with the method, and as you enter samadhi, behind the emotions and the thoughts and other things is that you don't get identified with your method, and then you realize at that point that you're entering into that state of bliss and knowledge and existence with all things, and then like the Buddha nature that once he came to enlightenment, that he didn't have to do his certain Vedic because every practice was one with the infinite and becoming, separating the observer and experiencer.
Yeah, and that's in magic too, and in alchemy, right? Like the Rabindranath Tagore, I can never say his name. He did the story of the Philosopher's Stone where, the guru was sitting on the riverbank, and the student comes up and he goes, I heard you made the Philosopher's Stone. Like, where is it? Can I see it? Can you teach me how to make it? And the guru's like, yeah, I threw it over there. And the guy's like, what? Where is it? And so he spends all this time, looking in the riverbank, and then he's digging and digging, going, I gotta find it. And then he goes, wait a minute. He doesn't even care about it. He's over there, but it's true, you go, by going through that process, you get that level, which then, separates you from even having to want to do it. It's like I mentioned with the Sacred Magic of a Bremelin the Mage book, that, MacGregor Mathers found. The whole first chapter of the book is this rigorous stuff you have to do before you get to do the magic, where you cleanse yourself and go through basically these meditative rituals before you can even start to perform the magic. And it's once you go through that, you don't even care about the other stuff anymore because you have gotten to that realization, and it separates you from that clinging to the experiences and the methods. And it's true, that is a concept that permeates occult magic as well. Absolutely.
Concerning the plant consciousness, just wondering if you have come across anyone that has more of a negative or trepidatious theory about plant consciousness and what that means for our genetic evolution.
Well, yeah, there's lots of people.
From the plants,
Oh, totally.
Sort of slave-master sort of relationship.
Slave-master thing. Wow. Jeez, I haven't read that. That's interesting, though. That'd be good. That's like the Triffids, right? Matango.
What did we gain? We know what we gained from them, but what
did they get from us? Yeah. Right.
Pollen.
What?
Like the pollen.
What was the name again?
Like the pollen. P-O-L-L-A-N.
I thought you said pollen, like pollen from plants. I was going to say, that's crazy. Pollen writes about plants?
What specifically?
Botany desire.
Oh, botany of desire. That sounds good. That's a good one. Thanks. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah, how do you think we can move from a society that is so driven by materialism and objectifying things to one that's, I think, a little better?
It's like Gandhi, right? You gotta be the change you want to see. The only way you can do it is to just try and put it in yourself first.
So have faith that it's like that and just kind of be that?
Do you just be it? I mean, which is really hard to do, but everyone, even if you want the world to be that way, but you yourself can't, it's so hard to come out of materialism. I can't say that I do it all the time. It's just how we, you kind of have to be a materialist to even talk to people or function, right? Otherwise everyone thinks you're totally cuckoo. And I mean, I'm pretty okay with people thinking I'm cuckoo at this point, but you have to be a little bit materialistic. I mean, I guess you don't have to be. I shouldn't say it like that. But
I guess I didn't mean materialism is bad in and of itself. But
right.
I think there's a little too much of it.
Right, to try and break out of that. I know. I think literally it's just individuals have to start and talking about it to people, talking about this kind of stuff to people, say, hey, how about Descartes? Pretty dumb, huh? Just have people start to think about that, think about what these people are saying and the implications of them, and instead of just because there's some old philosopher from however many years ago doesn't mean that they were right, and to really kind of look at things in a broader spectrum and examine those implications, and you can see it everywhere in how you live.
Well, I think most of them are wrong. I mean, if you
I do
try
too.
to understand things because you're not okay with the way things are, it doesn't matter what you say.
I know, exactly. Totally. Uh-huh.
got this great book by Jung, the graphic novel. I keep resonating.
That's a graphic novel? That's
awesome
rad.
From Skylight Books, but the gentleman in the front, I keep resonating on things he's talking about, but this quote in here has really been blowing my mind. It's been really inspirational.
Uh-huh.
It says, you're beginning to realize that whatever is wrong in the world is in yourself. Learn to deal with your own shadow and you'll do something real for the world.
Yeah, it's totally exactly what we were just saying. It's the same with how I said about the storms and controlling the weather, right? You control your own brainstorms, and then it translates to the storms outside. Yeah.
I think, like, Abraham Maslow talked about meta needs.
Meta needs, yeah.
Meta needs. So if you transform your consciousness and you try to transcend these things that plague us in our culture, now the meta need is to be open, because when you're in nature, the way to feel magic in nature is to be open. And nature gives us this way to feel open naturally. It's a very distinct difference from being there and then going into the city,
right?
Where you feel closed. And how do you bring that consciousness back in when there is?
You have to remember that the city is nature too, and cities are totally natural expressions of nature, right? Mm-hmm. It's like the samurai going to battle, right? For him, he can be zen because the same principle is true when he's sitting by himself in his room as when he's like chopping off a bunch of people's heads. Like that nature is also in the city, which is like the hardest thing to think about, but that keeping in nature, it's easier to access because it's like there. You have to try harder in the city because there's so much like craziness. Just like, you have to just really kind of keep it with you in the city and realize that it's there too. It's everywhere you go on the planet Earth. You can be just as open to it. If you try doing a meditation like in the middle of downtown, everyone thinks they have to go to the mountains to meditate and be by a stream. But try doing it on, like, First and Main. As long as you don't see a bunch of freaks around you, like, so you don't get in danger, But try and do it, like, in the middle of the city. Because I always love that, Love and Rockets line that you can't go against nature.
Part of nature, too.
Because when you do go against nature, you're part of nature, too. So it's the same with cities and wars and battlefields and all that stuff. And, like, I can say that sitting on the stage, but it's like, okay, realizing that if you're, like, in Afghanistan in the middle of a war field, like, that's gnarly. But, like, Thich Nhat Hanh talked about that, too, when he was, like, in the Vietnam War, like, out in the battlefields. And I love the stuff that he writes because it's so Bushido, where he would keep that connection to God and everything while he'd be seeing people blown to bits in front of his eyes. And you can keep that with you everywhere, not just in the placid, nice places, but in the terrible places too.
Or Viktor Frankl too.
Viktor Frankl, very good example. In the Holocaust, in the incinerators, like you can keep it there too, and that is. People always want to think it's only in the nice places, like the super rad temples or whatever, but it's also in the terrible places, right? Then you get into the tantrikas who go literally to the cemeteries and to the cremation mounds and to those horrible places, and there it is too.
I think also, I guess I've been thinking about in the I Ching they talk about the darkening of the light, like you have to darken the light.
Right.
Well then, and that's also like a part of it, the closing off of openness. So that's I understand what you're talking about also, but there's that thing too that feels so it just the concept of that just seems so sad.
It is. It's totally sad. It's super sad, but it's like necessary, It's how things go, like that cycle. Like it's not light all the time, and light has darkness too. But that doesn't mean it's like bad or a terrible part of the thing. It's like just a part of the thing, But I know it's a bummer. So on that bummer note, thanks, guys.